So today we're going to talk about lake regulation. Well, we're going to talk about immutability in data lakes. So the main idea and the impact privacy regulations are having on that. So in the beginning, people really thought about data lakes as being these immutable stores, and you basically dumped all of your company's snapshots of, and because it's in like a blob store in most cases, you dump snapshots of your data in there, and you can do these massive operations against it. And the different kinds of data go in there, right? Like you can have mass market data. Like I worked at a regulator and we actually kept people's trade, not people's, but the exchanges trade data in there. So that's pretty anonymized, not really tied to a person. But there's a lot of data that goes into the lake that's actually tied into individuals or individuals and organizations. And and what we did is we put that data, people put that data in the lake, and the notion is it was immutable, and you could go back across time and figure out, hey, here's a copy of this data set from 3 years ago, and here's a copy from today and what changed, or you could do all kinds of operations against it. But really, you didn't worry about what the length of time the data needed to be in there. And because of the simple model of this immutability, a lot of people just relied on the storage. So you could say, hey, I'm going to put a policy on this storage in the cloud. I'm really talking because that's where big data really lives. You could put a policy on that storage to say this data is going away after a certain amount of time, and the storage would clean it up for you and you'd be good to go, right? But really, a lot of people didn't implement it very well, and why bother? Because if you got a 7-year retention plan and this is year 2, you got 5 years to figure out how you're going to implement the retention plan. So what's actually happened though is there's been a ton of privacy rule changes about what data people can hold and how long they can hold it, and then how people will find out what you know about them. What's happened is we had this notion of an immutable lake. You just write another copy out every time you need an update on relatively slow-moving data sets, and you use relational and other databases for data that changed. Well, now it turns out the lake's actually got to change, right? So, and the reason is because of these rules. So what are the main rules for this? One of them is the forget my data rule, right? Like right to be forgotten. So if I tell you you need to forget my data and there's some regulation around it, then it turns out you got to figure out all the places where my data exist, all the copies that meet the requirement. And then you got to figure out a way to go modify that to remove my name or remove those records. And if you have an immutable lake, that doesn't work, right? So the immutable lake is completely dead for customer data, for any kind of individual data or data where privacy rules are going to come into play. Another rule that we have is, hey, we're going to terminate a relationship with this customer, and then the amount of time we keep that data would be less. If you're a customer, we might keep your transactions in your bank account forever because you want to be able to see those statements. But as soon as you terminate that transaction, we may only keep that data for 3 more years or N number of years, right? So the rules actually change based on your current status with the company. And so that means we can't use storage-based, for large data sets, we can't use storage-based rules anymore. And another one we end up with is this PII problem. So it turns out when you dump a bunch of data in the lake, it may be that you actually put personally identifying information into that data, and it can be by accident. I saw a place, one place where they were chat logs, and people were never supposed to put their passwords or any of that kind of stuff in the chat log, and it turned out they did, and we had to go back and scan through all those chat logs that were in the lake and then go remediate that, not by deleting them, but by masking out what they did so that we could retain the chat logs until the data retention period ended. So this has really changed. So what has it done to our complexity? So I tried to come up with a way to describe the complexity of managing data in the lake, and it may be that some of your data shouldn't be in the lake anymore. Or you got to do a much better job or buy a product or build something that's a step up to make this work. In the beginning, on the left-hand side, basically we had 2 rules. We had data set retention on the data set level, basically set by storage. Hey, there's a time to live on this document, this table, this CSV file, and it's 7 years, and at 7 years, the storage is just going to clean it up. The only thing that really busted that was legal holds. So if it turned out you're in the middle of a lawsuit or there's something going on or there's an investigation going on, the legal hold will actually break that retention period, right? So that causes some problems. So like I said, a lot of people set retentions way out and they figured they'd save it later, and that way if they had legal holds, they didn't have a problem. But none of this really mattered because all the first gen lake builders didn't put any retention in anyway. So now we're getting to the point where we actually have to do retention. So in this graph, the little slightly darker color usually means it came in this time frame. What did we end up having to do that made the lake mutable? Well, one of the things which I mentioned before was we have to do privacy attribute matching. If personally identifying information made it in the lake, and that means that people can see that PII or PCI or PI, private information, depends on what your naming convention is. So we actually need to be able to go out and take data sets that exist in the lake, that are in an immutable lake, and change the values in some of the fields, sometimes an entire column worth, right? So obviously it's not immutable there. It's immutable to the producer, unless we have, although in some places you may want the producer to regenerate the data, not mask it on your own. The other one is, so before we did data set retention at the storage level, so that would be like the file, like the massive data set itself. Now that we store those in virtual tables, a lot of times people, their second level of this, still using storage controls, is they break the data up by dates, and then they just set the expiration date on the individual files, right? Or they're set by the last mod date or something in those files, and if the files are immutable, you're good to go. Obviously, if you have to come back and do privacy maxing, you change all the dates, and suddenly the TTLs don't work anymore. The other one is, so we may get data set legal holds on whole documents before. Now we're starting to see maybe data set records, individual records in files that have holds, right? So if there's an investigation going into user customer X, and their data is in a bunch of data set files in the lake, and those are actually set to expire, are you going to not expire the data, keeping it all longer than you need to, or are you going to expire all the data and just retain the records that were for the record holds? So you got to really think about that, right? So that's kind of where we were, I don't know, maybe like a year ago. And then between CCPA, European right to be forgotten, a couple other things, we moved into the right-hand side of this. And I would argue we added a couple things. The users can actually request to be forgotten now. So it's outside of the business process. It's outside of the retention rules for legal reasons. And the user can say, hey, you should forget me. In that case, you got to go hunt down all the places where their data, where you could use it for marketing or for anything else, where that data exists, and then go expunge that at the record level. So we started at the data set level, and then we kind of went down to the file level, which could make multiple files in a data set. And now we're at the record level. So the lake actually needs to be mutable down to the record level. We had some of that with the privacy masking, right? But that tended to be masked. We would just scan the whole document, privacy mask it, and come back. In this case, we actually might need to delete or mask off the entire record. Like maybe we'll leave a key there, but mask out all the data. And by mask, I mean replace it with something that can't be backed into later. The other one, another one which I ran into recently, which probably everybody already knew, was if a user terminates a relationship with a company, the rules are now that that company can only keep that data for a certain amount of time, and that may be shorter than the record retention. So you have active users in a data set, and then you've got users that have been terminated. You may actually need to start filtering the users out of that data set in the lake, because you're not allowed to use that data for marketing or other purposes anymore, or even planning unless it's completely anonymized. You could do that. So you have these two additional ones. The other one that kind of came in was regulatory requirements around certain data sets by type are different than the rest of the lake. So like machine learning in some cases may have really long times because they're going to be looking for bias in training data and how the training data was calculated, because now you're actually having decisions made by machines instead of people. And so they need a record of how the decision-making process was trained up. And so that may change the retention on that. And sometimes that almost looks like a hold. Like some people are worried they're going to have to keep those indefinitely, right? So that's not one where it's mutable, but it did change the retention. And kind of the yellow ones on the bottom are kind of the exception cases, and the ones across the top in gray, it was an attempt to really come up with kind of, hey, what are the things we got to worry about in a data lake? And I guess the real question is, does your lake make sense for certain kinds of data anymore, right? Or maybe it does, and you just got to put a whole bunch of processors in it. So good luck with that, and I hope this was useful. Bye.